Okay, ready for this. We're going deep on willful blindness today.
Willful blindness.
Why we ignore the obvious, even when it's staring us right in the face. Our guide is Margaret Heffernan's book, Willful Blindness. And man, this stuff gets deep.
Deep, yeah. It's not just about being ignorant, it's about actively blocking things out.
Yeah,
Because the truth is just too much to handle.
right. And Heffernan starts with a legal case, the Enron scandal.
Oh, yeah.
You remember that one, right? Turns out there's this whole concept of willful blindness, legally speaking, and the judge in the Enron trial actually used it to instruct the jury.
Yeah, Judge Lake told the jury they could find the executives guilty, even if they didn't actively seek out the information. If they just avoided knowing what was going on in their own company, they had the opportunity to know, and that was enough.
So wait, you're telling me I can be held responsible for something I could have known, even if I didn't specifically try to find out?
Basically, yeah.
Man, that's unsettling. Makes you think about all the things we might be choosing to ignore in our own lives.
It does. And Heffernan says willful blindness is everywhere, not just big corporate scandals. Think about those marriages where one person's totally clueless about their partner's affair, even with all the signs,
Right.
or people who skip doctor's appointments when they know they don't feel good.
It's like we create these little bubbles of denial around ourselves,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
But why? Why do we do that? Is it just human nature to look away from the stuff that makes us uncomfortable?
Well, it's complicated, but Heffernan gives some good explanations. Sometimes it's just too much information, like our brains can only handle so much.
Right.
But a lot of times, it's about protecting ourselves, psychologically. We want to hold on to a positive image of ourselves, even if we have to ignore evidence that says otherwise.
Okay.
Or we hold on to certain beliefs so tightly that we just dismiss anything that challenges them.
So our brains are kind of like master rationalizers then,
Pretty much.
creating these narratives to protect our ego
Yeah,
and protect our worldview.
exactly. And then there's fear,
Yeah.
fear of conflict,
Right.
fear of change.
Mhm.
These are big motivators to just keep our heads buried in the sand.
For sure. And we can't forget about the money factor. We all know money can be a powerful motivator, but Heffernan says it can also be a big source of willful blindness.
Absolutely. Money can really warp how we see risk and reward. Like, it can make us super short-sighted when it comes to ethics. She tells this story about a mortgage lender who got caught up in the subprime mortgage boom. He was making so much money, he didn't see how risky the loans were. They were totally unsustainable.
So it's like the potential for profit creates this tunnel vision
Yeah, tunnel vision.
where we only see what we want to see.
Exactly. And it's not just individual greed. It's like a whole culture of greed,
Right.
that can take over entire industries.
Oh, for sure.
Heffernan also talks about research, showing that even being exposed to the idea of money can make us less helpful and more self-reliant. Like, it makes us focus on our own gains and losses. We're not as tuned in to other people's needs.
Huh. That's a sobering thought. It really makes you wonder what we're sacrificing when we chase those financial rewards.
It does. Now, Heffernan also argues that one of the most common drivers of willful blindness is our affinity for the familiar. We gravitate toward things and people who are like us,
Right.
who share our beliefs.
Makes sense.
Yep.
We like to be around people who confirm what we already think,
Mhm.
right? It's comforting.
It is.
But Heffernan takes this idea even further. She uses this story about a couple, Rebecca and Robert, to show how this bias can play out in our relationships. They're both like super successful, athletic, driven, and they love that about each other. But Heffernan asks how much they're missing out on by being so similar. How much is their shared worldview, limiting their understanding of the world?
It's a good question.
It really is. So even when we think we're being open-minded, we might be unconsciously drawn to people and information that just reinforces our existing biases.
Exactly. And this goes beyond who we're friends with or who we marry. This affinity bias can affect our news sources, our social media feeds, even the books we read. We create these echo chambers where we only see information that validates what we already believe.
It's like narrowing our taste in music or food. You might think you're being efficient by sticking to what you know, but you're actually missing out on a whole world of experiences or flavors.
Exactly.
It's not just about taste, though, right? This can affect our ability to think critically and make good decisions.
Absolutely.
This whole affinity biases thing is pretty thought-provoking. So we're drawn to the familiar, and that very attraction can lead to these blind spots.
It can.
But surely it can't be all bad, right? Our affinity for people like us also helps us build strong communities and relationships.
Of course. Those bonds are important.
Right.
Heffernan's not saying we need to ditch our friends and surround ourselves with people we disagree with.
Right.
It's more about recognizing that this natural tendency can have a downside.
Okay, so being aware of the potential downsides, right? Like our affinity bias can lead to intellectual stagnation and echo chambers,
Yeah,
and it can make us reluctant to engage with different points of view.
exactly. And this isn't just a social or cultural thing. Heffernan talks about research that shows how our brains are wired to prioritize the familiar, even visually. She brings up this researcher, Justin Burton.
Okay.
He studies visual attention. He says our brains are actually better at noticing familiar faces and information compared to unfamiliar ones.
Wow. So on a neurological level, we're predisposed to prioritize the familiar, but what does that mean for how we form opinions or make decisions, even fall in love?
That's where things get really interesting. We were just talking about how our brains are wired to prioritize the familiar. Well, this tendency has a huge impact on our relationships, especially when it comes to love. You know, they say love is blind.
Yeah, but I bet Heffernan doesn't just mean it in, like, the cute way.
No, not quite. She's saying that this blindness isn't just a quirky thing. It's a powerful force that shapes how we see things, how we act. She even brings up some research showing that people in love often have these really idealized views of their partners.
Okay.
And the crazy thing is, those idealized views can actually make people happier in their relationships.
So a little bit of love blindness might actually be a good thing, like rose-colored glasses for your relationship.
That's what the research suggests.
Yeah.
And Heffernan shares stories about her own marriage. Like, at first, she was so in love with her husband that she didn't see some of the challenges they would face. But over time, their love helped them work through those things, and their bond deepened.
Makes you wonder how many of us are overlooking flaws because we're blinded by love. Heffernan also tells this story about a doctor named Dick. He misdiagnosed his own mother's heart attack as indigestion.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Because he couldn't believe anything serious could be wrong with her. He loved her so much.
That's scary. If it can happen to a doctor, it can happen to anyone, right? Speaking of love being blind, she brings up Carmela Soprano from The Sopranos. I mean, talk about an example. She's married to a mob boss.
Oh, Carmela. She's a perfect example of how we ignore even the most obvious things to protect our family, our sense of who we are.
Right.
You know, if she admitted the truth about her husband, it would shatter everything.
It's easier to pretend everything's fine than to deal with that kind of reality. Heffernan also has a story about a woman named Louise. Louise was blind to her husband's drinking problem for years. She wanted that perfect family so badly that she just ignored all the warning signs.
It's like how those societal pressures, to conform to this perfect ideal can lead to blindness, and it can have serious consequences, especially when it comes to kids.
That's a really disturbing point, and it's backed up by some research she cites from a Canadian study on child abuse. It found that most sexual abuse cases involve stepfathers or other family members.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
It is. Heffernan even tells the story of a woman. She knew her partner had a conviction for child sex abuse, but she was still in love with him. And she tried to convince herself that it didn't matter. That's just terrifying to me.
I know. It's so scary how love can make us vulnerable to abuse.
But how do you even break free from this kind of blindness once you're in so deep?
Well, Heffernan compares it to those moments of sudden realization. Like when you walk into a surprise party.
Okay, I'm listening.
Picture this. You walk into a room, everyone shouts, "Surprise!" And suddenly, all those little things you didn't think about before, a canceled dinner, someone acting weird, it all clicks.
It all makes sense.
Exactly. And it's the same with love blindness. When you finally see the truth, all those memories, all the things you ignored, come flooding back.
And suddenly everything makes sense, often in a really painful way. She also talks about the case of Andrew O'Gorman. He repressed memories of abuse by a priest for years. He was so scared to say anything for his family, for his community.
That's a powerful story.
It is. It shows how silence protects abusers and how willful blindness allows these cycles of harm to just keep going. Speaking of systems that enable blindness, Heffernan takes us to the next level. The blinding power of big ideas.
Big ideas, right. We're not talking about just opinions. We're talking core beliefs, ideologies, the stuff that gives us meaning, the ideas we're willing to fight for.
And those ideas are so important to us that we become really protective of them, right? We don't want anything to challenge them.
Right. We develop this ideological blindness. We filter out anything that goes against our beliefs. It's like we build these mental walls to protect our worldview, and anything that threatens those walls, we got to shut it down.
Wow, that's a great analogy.
Thanks. Heffernan uses the example of Albert Speer, Hitler's architect. He was a high-ranking Nazi official, and he actually claimed he didn't know about the atrocities of the regime.
Wait, hold on. He was in Hitler's inner circle, and he said he didn't know about the concentration camps, the Holocaust. Come on, how's that possible?
I know, right? It's pretty hard to believe considering his position. As Minister of Armaments and War Production, he was actually in charge of getting forced labor for the war effort. His claims of ignorance are, well, questionable at best.
It seems like a textbook case of ideological blindness. He was so deep in the Nazi ideology that he couldn't see the horrific things it led to.
Yeah, and it's a terrifying example of how even intelligent people can be totally blind to reality when their worldview is threatened. And this isn't just something that happened in the past, it's still happening today all the time with political beliefs.
Oh, totally. We see it every day. People clinging to their political parties, no matter what evidence is presented. It's like they're immune to facts.
Exactly, and Heffernan talks about the work of Drew Weston, who researches this. He calls it motivated reasoning. Basically, our brains are really good at justifying what we already believe, even if it's objectively wrong.
So it's like we have this internal spin doctor twisting the facts to fit our worldview. No wonder it's so hard to have a civil political discussion these days.
It's definitely a challenge. And this motivated reasoning isn't just limited to politics. Heffernan talks about the medical field, specifically the story of Dr. Alice Stewart. She was a British physician who discovered that X-raying pregnant women led to childhood cancers.
Right, so back then, they thought it was safe to X-ray pregnant women? That seems crazy now.
I know, right? But back in the 1950s, people saw X-rays as a medical miracle. So when Dr. Stewart published her research, it was a huge deal. A lot of people in the medical establishment pushed back against her findings.
Because it challenged what they believed, right? Wasn't it called the threshold theory, that there was a safe level of radiation exposure?
Yes. And Dr. Stewart's research totally blew that theory out of the water. She proved that even small amounts of radiation could harm a developing baby. But instead of accepting this new information, many doctors just dug their heels in and stuck with the old theory.
Because accepting her research meant admitting they were wrong, that they might have unintentionally hurt patients. It's like their need to protect their beliefs, their reputation, was stronger than their desire to protect patients.
It's a classic example of how protecting our beliefs can lead to willful blindness, even when lives are at stake. To really dig into this idea of clinging to beliefs in the face of evidence, Heffernan takes us into the world of cults. She talks about Marion Keech, who led a doomsday cult back in the 1950s.
A doomsday cult? Okay, I'm interested.
So Keech convinced her followers that a massive flood was coming and that they would be rescued by flying saucers.
Flying saucers? Wow, that's a new one. Did the flood ever happen?
Of course not. But the interesting thing is, even when all the evidence proved them wrong, Keech and her followers refused to give up their belief. They'd twist the prophecies around, blame themselves for not understanding the messages, anything to avoid admitting they were wrong.
It's almost funny, but it also makes a serious point about how strong beliefs can be. We can see proof that we're wrong, but we still double down on our convictions. It's like we're bending reality to fit our worldview.
Exactly. Heffernan uses this term totalitarian ego to explain this. It basically means that our minds can work like a dictatorship, shutting down any information that goes against our core beliefs.
So it's not just denial, it's a deep-seated psychological mechanism, protecting our sense of self, even if it means clinging to something that isn't true.
It is. And this can have huge consequences, especially when it happens to people with power. She uses Alan Greenspan as an example. He was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he was a big believer in unregulated markets.
So his ideology shaped how he saw the entire economy.
Totally. And because of that, he didn't see the dangers of things like derivatives, those complex financial instruments that played a big part in the 2008 financial crisis. Even after the crash, Greenspan refused to admit his beliefs might have been wrong.
It's a perfect example of how ideological blindness can have massive consequences, not just for individuals, but for the whole world.
Exactly. And sometimes this blindness comes from something much simpler: exhaustion.
Ah, the blindness from being tired and overworked. We've all been there, right? But Heffernan argues it's way more serious than just feeling sluggish.
Right. She starts this section with the story of Warren Briggs. He was a control room operator at the BP Texas City refinery. He was working crazy hours, exhausted all the time, and one day, a bunch of errors led to a massive explosion.
Oh, that's awful. I remember hearing about that. Wasn't there an investigation?
Yeah, the Chemical Safety Board investigated and found that Briggs was sleep deprived. big time, and that caused something called tunnel vision.
Tunnel vision.
Yeah, he was so focused on a few tasks that he missed all the warning signs. Like, he didn't notice that a tank was overflowing with flammable liquid.
Oh my gosh. So he was so tired that his brain just couldn't process everything that was happening? It's crazy to think that lack of sleep can have such serious consequences.
I know. And it's not just physical safety. Being tired all the time affects our mental health, too. It makes us more stressed, more likely to burn out, and it leads to bad decisions. She brings up Electronic Arts, the video game company, and their crunch culture.
Oh, yeah, where employees were expected to work insane hours to meet deadlines.
Exactly. And the impact was terrible. There was even this blog post written by an EA employee's partner
Right.
that went viral, describing how this constant overwork was ruining their lives.
Yeah, and didn't she also point out that the quality of the games suffered? They were so burnt out, they were creating more bugs than they were fixing.
That's right. It shows that overwork hurts not just the people, but also the companies they work for. And a lot of times, this overwork culture is fueled by the myth of multitasking. You know, that idea that we can do a million things at once and be effective.
Multitasking. We've all been there, trying to juggle everything, thinking we're being super productive.
Totally. But the science is clear. Multitasking is a myth. Our brains just aren't designed to handle multiple complex tasks at the same time. When we multitask, we're really just switching our attention really fast between things. And that switching has a cost.
What kind of cost?
We lose accuracy, we become less efficient, and most importantly, our critical thinking skills suffer. We get more impulsive, we miss important details, and we become more biased.
So our brains basically go on autopilot.
Pretty much. And that's why it's so dangerous, especially in situations where the stakes are high. It can lead to accidents, mistakes, and missed opportunities. Heffernan uses the gorilla in the room experiment.
Oh, yeah, that's the one where people are watching a video, counting basketball passes, and they completely miss the guy in the gorilla suit.
That's the one.
Yeah.
It's a classic example of what's called inattentional blindness. Basically, we don't see things right in front of us because our attention is somewhere else.
So you can be looking right at something but still not see it.
Exactly. And it's not just some experiment. It happens in real life all the time.
Mhm.
Heffernan talks about this researcher who was listening to a podcast about the gorilla experiment. And he almost drove into a motorcycle because he was so focused on the podcast.
That's pretty ironic.
Right. It just shows that these mental blind spots can sneak up on us even when we know about them. And with smartphones and all the digital distractions, it's harder than ever to avoid inattentional blindness.
It's like we're training our brains to be distracted.
Yeah, it's like an epidemic. We
Yeah.
really need to be more aware of this and make a conscious effort to focus on one thing at a time, especially for important tasks.
So ditch the multitasking, focus on one thing at a time.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about another big driver of willful blindness, the pressure to conform.
Mhm.
You know, that need to fit in, to follow the rules, to not make waves.
It's a strong force. Everyone wants to be accepted, right? But Heffernan says this pressure to conform can make us blind to ethical problems. It can even contribute to huge disasters. She uses the sinking of the HMS Victoria as an example.
The HMS Victoria.
Yeah, it was a British warship that sank back in 1893. They were doing a training exercise, and the admiral gave an order that was impossible to carry out. But instead of questioning it, his officers just obeyed. And it resulted in a collision and a ton of casualties.
Oh, wow. So blind obedience can have serious consequences.
Yeah, and it doesn't just happen in the military. Think about hospitals. Nurses might not want to question a doctor's orders, even if they think something's wrong. Or companies where employees might go along with unethical stuff because they don't want to lose their jobs.
It's like sometimes the fear of speaking up is stronger than our own moral code.
Heffernan talks about the Milgram experiments. Those were some crazy studies that showed how far people will go to obey authority.
The ones with the electric shocks.
Yeah. They told participants to give shocks to another person, even when that person was screaming in pain. And a lot of them actually did it just because the experimenter told them to.
That's wild. It's like they gave up their own judgment and just did whatever the authority figure said.
Makes you wonder, are we all capable of that kind of blind obedience, given the right situation?
That's a scary thought.
It is. She also talks about a study that looked at nurses and how they obey doctors. They wanted to see if nurses would follow a doctor's orders, even if it meant putting the patient in danger.
Okay. And what happened?
They found that almost all the nurses were willing to give a patient way too much medication, just because the doctor told them to. Their sense of duty, their respect for the doctor, overrode their concern for the patient.
That's really disturbing.
It is. It shows how obedience can trump our own ethics. And it makes you think about how important critical thinking is, especially in fields like healthcare where it can be a matter of life or death.
Absolutely. Heffernan then talks about another kind of conformity, the pressure to go along with the crowd, even when you know it's wrong. She tells the story of Walt Pavlo, this guy who worked for MCI. He got involved in accounting fraud, not because he thought it was right, but because he saw everyone else doing it.
So it's that whole if everyone else is jumping off a bridge kind of thing.
Right, and it's a slippery slope. Pavlo started by telling himself that it was okay because everyone else was doing it. But the deeper he got, the harder it was to stop.
The more you conform, the more normal the bad behavior seems. Heffernan also brings up Solomon Asch and his famous experiments on conformity.
Oh yeah, those were classic.
The ones where they asked people to judge the length of lines and they ended up conforming to the group's wrong answer.
Yeah, just because they didn't want to be the odd one out.
It just shows how easy it is to doubt yourself when you're faced with social pressure.
Totally.
And this isn't just about avoiding awkwardness. Conformity can have serious real-world effects. Heffernan brings up the housing bubble and the financial crisis.
Right.
She tells the story about Deborah Laird, a woman who got caught up in flipping houses. She was making a ton of money, but it was all built on debt. And when the bubble burst, she lost everything.
Oh, man.
She got so caught up in the hype that she didn't see the risks.
She was blind to the danger.
And it's not just individual. She talks about the culture at Countrywide Financial. They were one of the main companies behind the subprime mortgage crisis. They were so focused on doing things their way, on making money, that they completely missed the fact that their whole business model was flawed.
It's like they built a culture where people couldn't speak up, where
Yeah.
critical thinking was discouraged.
Exactly. And this conformity wasn't just at Countrywide, it was industry-wide. So it was like this mass blindness driven by greed, fear, and pressure to conform.
Yeah, and it led to one of the worst financial crises in history.
It's a scary reminder that conformity can have devastating consequences. So how do we avoid falling into this trap? How do we have the courage to stand up for what we believe in, even when everyone else is going along with the crowd?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's something we'll talk more about as we continue to explore willful blindness.
So we've been talking about conformity and how that pressure to fit in can make us blind to so many things. Ethical issues, even huge financial disasters. But what about when we see something wrong happening and we just freeze? Like we do nothing. We just stand there.
Ah, the bystander effect. The more people who see something bad happening, an emergency, a crime, the less likely anyone is to actually do anything about it. It's like we all think someone else will take care of it.
Heffernan dives into the research on this by John Darley and Bib Latané. They did these experiments on the bystander effect, right? Like they staged fake emergencies in a lab.
Yeah, and when they had people filling out these questionnaires, and then boom, smoke starts filling the room.
Whoa, so they really made it feel like an emergency.
We did. And they found that if a person was alone, they almost always reported the smoke. But if there were other people in the room,
Way less likely to do anything.
so just having other people around made them less likely to respond.
Exactly. Everyone assumes someone else will handle it. Heffernan gives a real-life example of this. She tells the story of Annie, a nurse. Everyone knew she was incompetent, like she was a danger to patients.
Oh, no.
But nobody stopped her. They were scared of what would happen if they spoke up, or they just assumed somebody else would deal with it.
No.
And so Annie kept putting patients at risk. It shows how the bystander effect isn't just some theory. It can have really bad consequences. And it's not just hospitals, right? Heffernan talks about Enron, how employees saw all the shady accounting stuff but said nothing. She even talks about a meeting she went to with Disney execs. They knew about the whole digital music thing coming, how it was going to change everything, but they didn't do anything about it.
It's like this collective inaction, this fear of making waves. It can really take hold in any organization.
Heffernan connects this bystander effect to bullying, too, which, by the way, the Department of Justice says is the most underreported safety problem in schools.
That's a good point. So it's not just about failing to help someone. It's about letting harm continue, maybe even contributing to violence.
Exactly. So what's going on in our heads when we do this? Heffernan talks about how we have this conflict between our social selves and our moral selves.
Right, like when we're alone, we might do the right thing. But in a group, we get anxious, we don't want to stand out, and suddenly our morals go out the window.
We just want to fit in.
Yeah, and then there's cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance, huh?
It's easier to just tell ourselves everything's fine than to admit there's a problem, than that we should do something about it.
So how do we fight this bystander effect? How do we break free from this collective blindness and actually make things better?
We have to start taking responsibility
Right.
individually. We all have to build a culture where speaking up, taking action is normal, not
Mm.
this scary, risky thing.
It's about courage, right? Speaking up even when it's hard, even when you might face consequences.
It is. We have to remember that not doing anything is still a choice. And a lot of times it means we're okay with the bad stuff that's happening.
So we've been exploring all the ways we blind ourselves to the truth, but Heffernan doesn't just leave us hanging. She introduces us to people who actually fight against willful blindness.
The people who actually do something.
Yeah, the heroes. She calls them the Cassandras, the whistleblowers, the truth tellers. They see what's wrong and they have the guts to speak up, even when it's hard, even when they face pushback, even when it's dangerous.
She shares some pretty amazing stories about these people, like Lawrence Rockwood, who fought to protect prisoners in Iraq, even though it meant going up against his superiors, and Maria Garzino, an engineer who blew the whistle on those faulty flood pumps in New Orleans.
Yeah, and Joe Darby. He's the one who exposed the Abu Ghraib abuses, knowing he would be hated for it. And Cynthia Thomas, the nurse who reported malpractice. And Gayla Benailed, who wouldn't give up until people knew about the asbestos poisoning in Libby, Montana.
Those are some brave folks.
They are. So what makes them different? Why can they see what others miss and take action when others stay silent?
It seems like they all have a few things in common. They have a really strong sense of duty, a lot of empathy for people who are being hurt,
Mhm.
and they just can't stand by and watch bad things happen.
It's like their moral compass is just super strong. Nothing can make them look away.
Yeah, and Heffernan points out that a lot of these people suffer because of their actions. They get pushed out of their jobs, they get threatened, but they still speak up because they know it's the right thing to do.
Their stories are pretty inspiring, but it also makes you wonder if they can overcome willful blindness. Can't we all?
That's a good question, and Heffernan thinks we can. She actually dedicates a whole section of her book to strategies for fighting willful blindness.
So it's not just about individual heroes, it's about building a mindset, like a set of habits that help us see the world more clearly.
Exactly. And it starts with being okay with being uncomfortable. The truth is sometimes hard to face. But if we want to make things better, we can't shy away from it.
So we need critical thinking skills. We need to question our assumptions, look for different viewpoints, and be open to changing our minds.
Absolutely. And we need to know our biases. You know, those ways of thinking that can make us see things in a distorted way. She even suggests taking that implicit association test, the one that shows you your unconscious biases.
It's like we need good mental hygiene. We got to constantly check in with ourselves and ask, what am I biased towards? What am I not seeing? How can I be more objective?
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just about looking inward. We also need people in our lives who challenge us, people with different views, people who will call us out when we're wrong. Heffernan calls these people outsiders.
Yeah, those friends, colleagues, mentors, even just people we meet who make us think differently, see things from a new angle.
And sometimes we have to go looking for those outsiders. Read books that challenge us, go to events where we hear new ideas, talk to people we disagree with.
We have to be willing to step outside our comfort zone and admit we might be wrong.
That's a big one. Being able to say, hey, I was wrong, and then actually learning from it.
And this applies to organizations too, right? Heffernan talks about building open, transparent cultures where people can speak their minds, where they can challenge things and point out problems without being afraid.
Absolutely. It's about leaders who actually listen to criticism, who make decisions based on facts, not just their ego. It's about systems that help us see our blind spots, not hide them.
And realizing that making money can't be the only goal.
Right.
We have to think about the ethical side of things, what impact our choices are having on people and the planet.
It's about making conscious choices.
This deep dive has been, well, intense, but it's been eye-opening too. Like we've peeled back the layers of how we see things and gotten a clearer view of the world.
It really makes you think about all the ways we might be blind to the truth.
So what about you listening right now? What struck you during this deep dive? What connected with your own life?
Maybe there's something in your life where you've been willfully blind. A relationship, a job, even just a bad habit you can't shake.
Whatever it is, think about it for a second. What's keeping you blind? What's it costing you? And what would it take for you to finally see clearly?
Remember, admitting we can be blind is the first step.
We've only scratched the surface here. Heffernan's book is full of stories and research definitely worth checking out. But for now, I hope this deep dive has inspired you to be more aware, to ask more questions, and to be brave enough to face the truth, even when it's hard.
Keep your eyes open, stay curious, and don't be afraid to ask the tough questions. The truth might be uncomfortable, but it's always better than living in a lie.
And hey, if you come across any interesting examples of willful blindness out there in the world, we'd love to hear about them. We're always up for another deep dive.